The midday sun mercilessly lashed the parched Arizona land as the carriage kicked up a cloud of orange dust on the dusty road. Margaret Sullivan held tight to the bouquet of wildflowers that was beginning to wither under the scorching heat as she watched the barren landscape stretch endlessly in all directions. His hands trembled slightly, not only from the uneven swaying of the carriage over the loose stones of the path, but from the anxiety that grew in his chest like a storm brewing on the horizon. The 23-year-old wore a simple white cotton dress, the only one she could buy with the few coins that remained after her father's death in Boston. The fabric clung to her sweaty skin, and she could feel the fine desert dust settling on every fold of the garment. Her brown hair was tied in a bun that struggled to stay in place, with a few unruly strands dancing in the wind that came in through the open windows of the carriage. The coachman, a middle-aged man with a grey beard and a worn leather hat, occasionally looked back through the small mirror hanging in front of the carriage. He noticed the passenger's nervousness and the way she held the crumpled paper with the address written by hand. For the entire 3-day drive from Phoenix, she had read and reread those faded lines dozens of times, as if words could magically change. Margaret remembered the carefully written words in the letter she received 2 months ago. A widowed farmer was looking for a wife to take care of his property and his 2 young children. The proposal came through a marriage agency that promised to unite lonely hearts in the Wild West. At the time, with her father's debts piling up and no prospects in a Boston that offered no opportunities for women alone, the idea seemed like a divine blessing. Now, with the ranch looming on the horizon, doubts hammered in his mind like galloping horses' hooves. What did you know about Thomas Mackenzie besides the 3 formal letters they exchanged? That he was 35 years old, lost his wife in the birth of his 2nd child 2 years ago, and raised cattle on a property inherited from his father. The descriptions were practical, direct, without any romanticism or promise of true love. The carriage swayed violently as it passed a hole in the road, causing Margaret to cling to the cracked, leather-upholstered seat. Through the dusty window, she began to make out the first wooden structures on the horizon. Barbed wire fences stretched along the road, enclosing pastures where horses and cattle grazed under the scant shade of parched trees. The warm air brought the characteristic smell of animals, hay and dry land. The coachman pulled the reins and the carriage slowed as they approached the main gate of the ranch. Margaret felt her heart race when she saw the faded letters painted on a wooden sign hanging between 2 poles. Mackenzie Ranch. Her hands sweated even more, and she wiped her palms on her dress, leaving damp marks on the white fabric. But something was wrong. Very wrong. As the carriage drove onto the property, Margaret realized that the place did not match the descriptions on the letters. The main house, which was supposed to be a solid 2-story building with a wide porch, was actually a smaller structure, with peeling planks and cracked glass windows. The barn at the back was visibly in disrepair, with part of the roof collapsed and doors hanging from the rusted hinges. Even more disturbing were the men who began to emerge from different points on the property. They were not ordinary rural workers. They were shadowy figures, with dark, dusty clothes, hats pulled over their eyes, and what alarmed Margaret most, they all carried guns attached to worn leather belts. Some had visible scars on their faces. Others kept their hands close to their guns at all times, as if they expected trouble at any moment. The coachman also noticed the tense atmosphere, and his posture changed noticeably. He straightened his shoulders, and his right hand instinctively moved toward the rifle he kept next to the seat. His experienced eyes scanned the surroundings, silently counting how many armed men were strategically positioning themselves around the carriage approaching the main house. Margaret felt the blood run cold in her veins when she noticed that some of the men wore bandanas covering part of their faces, and their clothes looked like someone who lived on the road, sleeping in the open and eating stolen preserves. They were not cowboys or honest cowboys. They were outlaws, thugs who had turned the Mackenzie Ranch into their hideout. The carriage stopped in front of the house with a creaking of the wooden brakes. The silence that followed was broken only by the snort of tired horses and the distant sound of the wind passing between the abandoned buildings. Margaret held the bouquet so tightly that some stems snapped between her fingers, releasing a sweet perfume that contrasted brutally with the smell of danger that hung in the air. One of the men approached the carriage with slow, deliberate steps. He was tall, thin, with a stubble of several days, and eyes that seemed to have seen too much for a young man. A jagged scar cut his left cheek from the ear to the corner of his mouth, and when he smiled, his yellowed teeth appeared as a silent threat. The coachman slowly stepped down from his seat, keeping his hands visible and away from any weapon. Margaret remained motionless inside the carriage, feeling every fibre of her body worn of the mortal danger that surrounded her. Through the dusty window she could see more men positioning themselves behind barrels, fence posts and wooden structures, all with guns drawn. It was then that she heard the sound that made her blood run completely cold. Small, quick footsteps running towards her, followed by the high-pitched, innocent voice of a child. A boy of approximately 6 years old appeared running down the side of the house with unkempt blonde hair and dirt-stained clothes. His blue eyes shone with a mixture of curiosity and hope that contrasted violently with the sinister atmosphere of the place. The boy stopped abruptly when he saw the woman in the white dress inside the carriage, and his face lit up with a pure and genuine smile. He ran to the carriage door and, without any hesitation, held out his dirty little hand toward Margaret, as if he had known her for years and was simply happy to see her come home. Margaret looked down at the small, dirty hand stretched out toward her, feeling her heart break as she saw the pure innocence in the boy's blue eyes. He couldn't have been more than 6 years old, with blonde hair that was in dire need of a cut and clothes that were once white but now bore the marks of outdoor play and lack of proper care. Her bare feet were covered in red dirt, and there was a stain of something that looked like homemade jam at the corner of her mouth. Hesitant but unable to ignore the innocent gesture, Margaret held out her gloved hand and allowed the boy to help her out of the carriage. The child's small, warm touch contrasted brutally with the tense atmosphere that hung over the ranch. The armed men watched the scene with expressions ranging from curiosity to distrust, some whispering to each other as they kept their hands close to their weapons. The boy held Margaret's hand tightly and pulled her toward the house, chattering excitedly about things that only a child would consider important. He talked about a cat he had found in the barn, about the flowers that grew behind the house, and about how happy he was that someone had finally come to visit them. His childlike voice echoed through the warm afternoon air like a ray of light through a dark storm. Margaret walked slowly beside the boy, her eyes constantly scanning the surroundings for signs of the property's true owner. Where was Thomas Mackenzie? Why was your house occupied by these dangerous men? And more importantly, how had this innocent child stopped in the middle of such a dangerous situation? The man with the scar on his face approached them with measured steps, his right hand resting casually on the handle of the revolver attached to his belt. He studied Margaret from top to bottom, with eyes that seemed to assess both her beauty and the potential for trouble she could pose. His presence radiated a dark authority that made the other men keep a respectful distance. The coachman stood beside the carriage, clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation. He had made many trips across the border and recognized the kind of men who now surrounded him. These were not honest farmers or farm workers. They were outlaws, probably fugitives with bounties on their heads, men who would not hesitate to kill to protect their secrets or defend their hiding place. Margaret tried to keep her composure as the boy continued to pull her hand, guiding it toward the wooden steps that led to the porch of the house. The planks creaked beneath his feet, some clearly loose and in need of repair. The white paint on the walls was peeling off in large chunks, revealing the dark wood underneath, and several windows had cracked or completely broken glass, covered with pieces of fabric or wood. It was then that a second child appeared at the door of the house. It was a girl of about 4 years old, with curly brown hair that fell over her shoulders and huge green eyes that seemed to hold a very deep sadness for someone so young. She wore a simple dress that was once pink, but was now faded and with some patches visible. The girl remained on the doorstep, shy, watching the woman in white with a mixture of curiosity and caution. The boy let go of Margaret's hand and ran to his sister, whispering something in her ear that made the girl's eyes widen even more. She looked at Margaret with an expression that mixed hope and fear, as if she had been disappointed many times before and didn't dare believe that something good would finally happen. Margaret felt a wave of maternal protection rise in her chest as she saw the 2 children. They were clearly not being cared for properly. Their clothes needed to be washed and repaired, their hair needed attention, and there was a thinness to their little faces that suggested that meals were not always guaranteed. How had these innocent children ended up in the hands of dangerous bandits? The man with the scar finally broke the heavy silence that had settled over the group. His voice was rough, loaded with tobacco and cheap whiskey, with an accent that suggested origins in the American South. He addressed Margaret directly, completely ignoring the coachman as if he didn't exist. Her words were blunt and blunt, explaining that she had arrived at the wrong place at the wrong time. The original Mackenzie Ranch was 5 miles to the north, but it had been abandoned after a series of Apache Indian raids the previous year. The real Thomas Mackenzie had died defending his estate, and his family had returned to relatives in the east. Margaret felt the world swirl around her as she heard this information. All his hope for a new beginning, all the money spent on the trip, all the bridges burned in Boston, all had been in vain. She was alone in the middle of the desert, with no money to go back, surrounded by dangerous men who clearly had no moral scruples. But before she could fully process the magnitude of her desperate situation, the boy pulled back up her skirt and looked at her with those blue eyes full of hope. His next words were like a dagger piercing through his already shattered heart. He asked if she had come to stay and take care of them, if she would be the new mother they had asked God for every night. The girl approached shyly, holding out a small wildflower she had picked in the yard, her green eyes glowing with unshed tears as she waited for an answer that could change their lives forever. Margaret looked at the 2 children, then at the armed men who were watching them with increasing interest, and finally at the coachman who clearly wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. She was caught between compassion for innocent children and the brutal reality of her own perilous situation. The silence stretched out like a taut rope about to break, with everyone present awaiting his response. The hot desert wind whispered through the abandoned buildings, carrying the smell of a storm looming on the distant horizon. Dark clouds began to gather over the Rocky Mountains, promising a turbulent night that perfectly mirrored the chaos that had settled in Margaret Sullivan's life. Fate had played a cruel trick on her, but now 2 small lives depended on her next decision. Margaret gently grasped the wildflower the girl offered her, feeling the soft petals quiver between her fingers. The sweet scent of the little daisy contrasted with the acrid smell of gunpowder and sweat of the men who surrounded them. Their eyes moved between the hopeful faces of the children and the increasingly impatient expressions of the bandits, knowing that any wrong word could trigger uncontrollable violence. The coachman took a discreet step towards the carriage, clearly preparing for a quick escape if the situation deteriorated further. His years of experience on the dangerous roads of the frontier had taught him to recognize the signs of when desperate men were about to make fatal decisions. The air around the ranch seemed electrified, as in the moments preceding a violent storm. Margaret took a deep breath and made the decision that would change not only her life, but the fate of the 2 innocent children. She knelt before the boy and girl, placing herself at their eye level, and whispered words that made their little faces light up with pure and genuine joy. She said she would stay, at least for now, to take care of them as any child deserved to be cared for. The man with the scar watched the scene with renewed interest. There was something about this woman's quiet determination that piqued his curiosity. She hadn't screamed, passed out or begged to be taken away as most civilized women would when faced with a bunch of outlaws. Instead, she had chosen to stay for the sake of 2 children she didn't even know. The children embraced Margaret with desperate strength, as if they feared she might disappear at any moment. The boy buried his face in the white fabric of her dress, while the girl held tightly to his free hand, his little fingers intertwined with hers like a chain that could not be broken. Margaret felt tears burn her eyes as she realized how much these children needed love and care. The coachman approached hesitantly, whispering urgently that they needed to leave immediately. The road became dangerous after dark, with hostile Indians and other outlaw bands roaming the region. He couldn't guarantee her safety if they stayed there any longer. His words carried the weight of experience and genuine fear for his safety. But Margaret had already made her decision. She asked the coachman to return to Phoenix and send a message to the marriage agency, informing her that she had found her new family, even if it wasn't the way she had planned. The man protested vigorously, arguing that she did not understand the danger she was putting herself in by remaining in a bandit hideout. The leader of the band made a gesture with his hand, and 2 of his men approached the carriage. Their intentions became clear as they began to unload Margaret's small suitcase and the wooden box that contained her few personal belongings. The coachman understood that his presence was no longer welcome, and that any attempt to take Margaret away by force would result in violence. With visible reluctance, the coachman climbed back into the carriage seat. Before leaving, he looked directly at Margaret and promised that he would return with help as soon as he reached the nearest town. Her words were spoken loud enough for all to hear, a desperate attempt to discourage any violent action against her through the threat of future consequences. The carriage drove off amid a cloud of orange dust, taking with it Margaret's last connection to her former life. She watched the vehicle disappear into the winding road until it became just a distant dot on the rolling horizon. The sound of horses' hooves and wheels creaking gradually faded, leaving only the whispering wind and the occasional mooing away from the cattle. The boy pulled Margaret's hand and guided her into the house, eager to show her what her new home would be. The interior of the building revealed a story of neglect that made Margaret's heart clench. The furniture was covered in dust. There are dirty dishes piled up on the small kitchen table, and children's clothes strewn across the wooden floor that creaked with every step. The girl ran to a corner of the main room and picked up a patched rag doll, hugging it to her chest as she watched Margaret explore the room. The doll had lost an eye and her woolly hair was matted, but it was obviously the child's most precious treasure. She whispered the doll's name, Sarah, as if she were introducing her best friend. Margaret scanned the small kitchen and found that there were a few basic supplies: bags of beans, cornmeal, some preserves, and a piece of jerky hanging from a hook in the low ceiling. It wasn't much, but it would be enough to prepare suitable meals for the children for a few days. She had learned to cook out of necessity after her mother's death when she was still a teenager. Through the kitchen window, she could see the men spreading out around the property. Some made their way to the partially destroyed barn, others positioned themselves at strategic points around the ranch, and a smaller group gathered near a campfire. They began preparing for the night. Their low voices and occasional harsh laughter created an ominous soundtrack for the late afternoon. The leader of the pack entered the house unceremoniously, his dark eyes scanning every corner as if assessing necessary changes. He watched Margaret arranging the few utensils in the kitchen and noticed how the children kept close to her, like ducklings following their mother. There was something about the dynamic that intrigued him and at the same time worried him. He explained the basic rules of survival on the ranch. Margaret and the children would stay in the main house, but she was not to ask questions about the men's business or try to leave the property without permission. Any attempt to escape or betray would result in consequences that he preferred not to detail in front of the children, but his tone of voice made the implications very clear. Margaret nodded silently, realizing that she had become both a prisoner and a protection for the children. Her presence could serve as a facade of normalcy for the ranch, but it also meant that she was now deeply involved in criminal activity, whether she wanted to or not. As dusk painted the sky in orange and purple hues, Margaret prepared a simple meal for the children. They ate with a voracious appetite, suggesting that regular meals were not guaranteed in recent times. The boy told fragmentary stories about how they had gotten there, mentioning an uncle who disappeared one night and never returned. The storm that had been only a distant promise during the afternoon was now fast approaching. Lightning illuminated the Rocky Mountains on the horizon, followed by thunder that rolled across the plain like war drums. The wind increased in intensity, making the windows creak and carrying the characteristic smell of rain that was to come. Margaret put the children to sleep in a small bed they shared in the only room in the house. She softly sang a lullaby her own mother used to sing, watching as the tired little faces gradually relaxed and found the peace of sleep. For the first time in months, they slept knowing that someone was there to protect them. But when Margaret finally lay down on the narrow mattress in the corner of the main room, she remained awake for hours, listening to the nightly sounds of the ranch. Heavy footsteps circled the house, low voices chatted near the windows, and occasionally she heard the unmistakable sound of guns being loaded and checked. The storm finally arrived with full fury. The rain hammered the metal roof with deafening intensity, while the wind howled around the house like a wounded animal. Among the sounds of the storm, Margaret heard something that made her blood run cold: horses' hooves approaching rapidly through the pouring rain, followed by distant cries that echoed through the stormy night. Margaret rose silently from the narrow mattress, her bare feet touching the cold wooden floor. Through the cracks of the windows, she could see lantern lights dancing in the stormy darkness. The screams became clearer. They were military orders cutting off the night air. The sheriff had arrived with American cavalry troopers. The scarred man burst through the door like a hurricane, his wild eyes sweeping the dark interior. He held a revolver in each hand, and Margaret could see the barely controlled panic in his expression. The other bandits ran in all directions, some trying to catch up with their horses, others positioning themselves for a final showdown. The children woke up to the noise, their frightened eyes shining in the dim light. Margaret wrapped them both in her arms, forming a protective shield with her own body. whispering reassuring words even as her heart beat like a war drum. The first shots erupted like artificial thunder, piercing the night with flashes of golden light. Margaret pushed the children under the sturdy table, covering them as bullets whizzed through the air. For 15 eternal minutes she kept the children safe, softly singing the same lullaby, creating a bubble of peace in the midst of absolute chaos. Gradually the shooting stopped. Authoritative voices shouted orders, and Margaret heard handcuffs being put on. The door opened slowly, revealing the sheriff, a middle-aged man with a grey mustache and gentle eyes. He knelt down, extending his empty hands to show that he posed no danger. What followed would change their lives forever. The sheriff explained that the children were not random orphans. They were grandchildren of the real Thomas Mackenzie, the only rightful heirs to the original ranch north. There was a property waiting for them, with livestock, a solid house, and enough money in the bank to start over. Margaret felt a cautious hope grow in her chest. The sheriff watched her with an evaluative expression. He had witnessed her courage in protecting the children, seeing how they clung to her. The authorities were looking for someone responsible to take care of the little heirs. The boy gently tugged at Margaret's skirt and looked at her with those intense blue eyes. He whispered that he had prayed every night for God to send a mother, and he knew from the first moment that his prayers had been answered. The girl approached timidly, extending her withered but still beautiful wildflower again. Margaret knelt down and embraced the two children, with a strength that came from the depths of her soul. She whispered that yes, she would be their mother, and they would never be alone again. His tears mingled with theirs, tears of joy and relief. 3 weeks later, Margaret Sullivan officially became Margaret Mackenzie, adoptive mother and owner of the Mackenzie Ranch. Joshua proudly helped with the estate's work, while Emily planted wildflowers and cared for an orange kitten that mysteriously appeared. The ranch flourished under his care. More important than any financial success was the sound of childish laughter echoing through the house every morning, and the completeness she experienced in putting the children to sleep each night. Margaret often thought about the apparent mistake that had changed their lives. If she had arrived at the correct ranch, she would have married a man who had been dead for months. Instead, fate had guided her to two souls who desperately needed love and who had filled the void in her heart in unimaginable ways. On the silent desert nights, when the stars shone like diamonds, Margaret would sit on the porch watching Joshua and Emily play. The boy had fulfilled his innocent promise. She had indeed become their mother. Love, Margaret discovered, didn't have to follow conventional paths to be real. Sometimes the most precious blessings came disguised as tragedies, and the most frightening mistakes turned out to be the greatest gifts of fate. And so, under the endless sky of the American West, a family found happiness in each other's arms, proving that the true home is not a place, but where the heart finds peace and love its purest expression. What did you think of this exciting journey through the dangers and wonders of the Wild West? Margaret found much more than she bargained for when she entered the wrong ranch. She discovered her true purpose and a family that needed her as much as she needed them. What lessons has this story of courage, unconditional love, and intertwined destinies awakened in you? Leave your comment and share your reflections on how sometimes life's mistakes get us exactly where we need to be. Sign up to follow more exciting adventures that touch the heart and feed the soul.